Every small town has that one house, the one neighbors glance at but never truly see. In Slaughter, Louisiana, this was that house. From the outside, it was ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. But inside, a horror was unfolding in plain sight. A horror that would take 12 years to discover. When authorities finally entered on January 3, 2022, they found a scene so grotesque, veteran first responders recoiled. There, in the living room, was 36-year-old Lacey Fletcher, but not as anyone remembered her. Her body, fused to a couch, had literally become part of the furniture. Her skin, ulcerated to the bone. The air, thick with decay. And her parents? They'd been living alongside this nightmare, day after day, year after year. This isn't just a story of neglect. It's a story of blindness. How an entire community failed to notice a woman vanishing in slow motion. How two people, sworn to protect their child, allegedly watched as she melted into obscurity. Who was Lacey Fletcher? And how could something this inhuman happen in the modern world? Welcome to True Crime Story Network. A huge thank you to my viewers. If you find our stories thought-provoking and want to help support the growth of our community, please take a moment to subscribe. Subscribing ensures that you'll stay up to date with our latest insights, and it helps us reach an even wider audience, enabling us to continue sharing fresh perspectives and in-depth analyses every day. We genuinely appreciate your feedback, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Share your insights on this case, and don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far our stories reach. By liking, sharing, and commenting on our videos, you play a vital role in expanding this community and sparking meaningful conversations. Your participation makes a huge difference. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Now, let's continue with the story. January 3, 2022. A quiet morning in Slaughter, Louisiana, shattered by a call no first responder could ever unhear. When paramedics entered the Fletcher home, they weren't just walking into a house, they were stepping into a time capsule of horror, 12 years in the making. The air hit them first, that unmistakable metallic tang of decay mixed with something far worse. Then they saw her. Lacey Fletcher. 36 years old, but barely recognizable as human. Her emaciated frame had become one with the living room couch, her body forming a grotesque silhouette in the fabric. The cushions had literally grown around her, the springs embedded in flesh that had ulcerated down to bone. The scene told a story no words could capture. A crater in the couch where years of immobility had worn through layers of fabric and foam. Feces caked so thick it formed a second skin. The telltale wriggling of maggots in open wounds that had never known treatment. This wasn't just death, this was an erosion of humanity, millimeter by millimeter, day after excruciating day. And perhaps most incomprehensible of all, the normalcy surrounding this nightmare. A television that still played. Dishes in the sink. Sheila and Clay Fletcher moving through this house of horrors like any other parents in any other home. Their explanation? That Lacey had severe social anxiety, that she simply didn't want to move. 12 years. 4,380 days of watching their daughter become part of the furniture. But this wasn't anxiety. This wasn't a choice. What investigators uncovered in that living room was the forensic evidence of a crime, not of violence, but of unbearable indifference. To understand the tragedy of Lacey Fletcher's final years, we must first see her as she once was, not as a victim frozen in that horrific couch, but as a living, breathing young woman with a story that began long before the neglect. The few existing photographs show a smiling, bright-eyed girl growing up in small-town Louisiana. By all accounts, Lacey was quiet but engaged with the world around her, attending local schools, interacting with neighbors, existing as a visible member of her community. But somewhere around 2010, when Lacey was just 24 years old, something changed. The outgoing young woman the community knew began disappearing, not suddenly, but gradually, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Doctors would later speculate about possible undiagnosed conditions, autism spectrum disorder, perhaps, or some degenerative condition. But speculation is all it remains, because at that critical juncture when most families seek help, the Fletchers did the opposite. No medical evaluations. No therapy sessions. Just a systematic erasure of Lacey's presence from the world beyond their front door. The isolation was absolute. No more school enrollments. No doctor visits. Not even the casual interactions most of us take for granted, no brief chats with mail carriers, no waving to neighbors from the porch. While other young adults her age were building lives, Lacey's world shrank to the dimensions of that single house, then eventually to the confines of that single couch. This wasn't a disappearance in the traditional sense. There was no missing persons report, no desperate search. Just a slow, silent vanishing witnessed by two people who should have protected her above all others, her parents. The very people who would later claim they were simply respecting her wishes as they watched her body literally disintegrate over 12 unbearable years. The horror of Lacey Fletcher's final years wasn't born in a single moment, but in thousands of daily decisions, each one a small surrender to inhumanity. Like the slow turning of seasons, her suffering accumulated gradually, almost imperceptibly, until the unthinkable became reality. 2010 marked the last confirmed sighting of Lacey in public, a young woman of 24 who still had her whole life ahead of her. As months turned to years without any sign of her, neighbors would occasionally ask after Lacey. Her parents offered vague explanations: she was traveling, she was unwell, she preferred to stay inside. These half-answers satisfied casual inquiries, and so the questions stopped coming. Inside the Fletcher home, a different story unfolded. With each passing year, Lacey's world contracted further. First from the community, then from the neighborhood, then from the house itself, until eventually her entire existence centered on that single couch. Her parents would later claim she refused to move, but medical experts would point to the physical impossibility of this explanation. The advanced stage of her ulcers suggested she hadn't been able to move for years. The timeline of neglect reveals its own terrible arithmetic: 12 years equals approximately 4,380 sunrises and sunsets. 4,380 opportunities to call for help. 4,380 mornings when someone could have changed course. Instead, each day added another layer to the tragedy: another day without medical care, another day of untreated wounds, another day of a human being slowly disappearing in plain sight. Perhaps most chilling is how ordinary life continued around this atrocity. Bills were paid. Groceries were bought. Holidays came and went. All while just feet away, a woman was literally rotting alive. This wasn't just passive neglect, it was an active, years-long conspiracy of silence between two people who made a choice, every single day, to let their daughter suffer rather than face the truth of what they'd allowed to happen. When Sheila and Clay Fletcher finally stood before a judge, the courtroom air vibrated with unspoken questions. How does a civilized society punish those who allowed their own child to disintegrate over 12 years of calculated neglect? The legal system's answer would prove as controversial as the crime itself. Prosecutors initially leveled second-degree murder charges, an acknowledgement of the unimaginable suffering inflicted not in moments, but across thousands of days. Yet when the gavel finally fell, the outcome felt shockingly disproportionate to many observers. A plea bargain reduced the charges to manslaughter, with each parent receiving 20-year sentences to be served concurrently, meaning they could potentially walk free in as little as 10 years. The district attorney's office cited practical hurdles: the difficulty of proving intent in neglect cases, the challenges of reconstructing events spanning a decade, the lack of eyewitnesses beyond the perpetrators themselves. But these legal nuances rang hollow to those who saw the crime scene photos, who heard the medical examiner describe how Lacey's body had fused with furniture, who understood that her suffering had been measured not in minutes, but in years. Public outrage erupted as the sentence was announced. 20 years for 12 years of torture. The math felt obscene. Online forums and town hall meetings alike buzzed with the same uncomfortable question: had Lacey Fletcher's life been valued at less than 2 years per year of her suffering? The case laid bare uncomfortable truths about how our legal system quantifies, or fails to quantify, crimes of prolonged neglect versus crimes of sudden violence. Perhaps most damning was what the sentence implied about accountability. By accepting the plea deal, the court sent a message that even the most extreme cases of familial neglect would be treated as tragic failures rather than deliberate atrocities. For Lacey's memory, and for countless other invisible victims of domestic neglect, this precedent would linger long after the Fletcher sentencing paperwork was filed away. Lacey Fletcher's tragedy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Her suffering didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a neighborhood, in a community, in a society that somehow failed to see the invisible prison being constructed behind closed doors just feet away from ordinary life. The warning signs were all there, written in the language of absence rather than action: the gradual disappearance from public view. The lack of medical records for an adult who clearly needed care. The carefully constructed excuses that satisfied casual inquiries. These are the fingerprints of neglect, not dramatic cries for help, but quiet erosions of personhood that too often go unchallenged. What makes Lacey's case so shattering is its ordinariness. No barbed wire fences. No soundproofed walls. Just the slow, insidious power of isolation and the terrible human capacity to normalize the unthinkable. It begs the question, how many other invisible tragedies are unfolding right now in houses we pass every day? Honoring Lacey means breaking this cycle. It means understanding that intervention isn't intrusion, it's humanity. Every state has adult protective services. Every community has resources. The next time something feels off about a neighbor's situation, when you realize you haven't seen someone in years, when excuses don't add up, when basic human needs seem unmet, that's your cue to act. Because the opposite of neglect isn't simply attention, it's courage. The courage to ask uncomfortable questions. The courage to report suspicions. The courage to remember that society is only as strong as our willingness to see those everyone else has learned to ignore. Lacey's voice was silenced, but her story speaks volumes. The question is, are we listening? In the quiet corners of ordinary towns, behind unremarkable doors, the most extraordinary tragedies often unfold unseen. Lacey Fletcher's story forces us to stare directly into one of society's darkest blind spots. The horror that can fester when we mistake privacy for indifference, when we confuse "not our business" with "not our responsibility." Remember her name. Not as a sensational headline, not as a true crime curiosity, but as a vibrant human being whose light was extinguished one neglected day at a time. Remember the girl in those old photographs, full of potential, before she became a statistic. Remember that her suffering spanned administrations, economic cycles, cultural eras, 12 years of national change while her world stood horrifically still. This isn't just about Lacey. It's about the countless vulnerable people slipping through society's cracks right now. The elderly neighbor whose mail piles up unseen. The child who stops appearing at school. The adult with disabilities whose caretakers grow resentful. These are our collective responsibility. If this story unsettles you, as it should, let that discomfort move you to action. Memorize the number for adult protective services in your state. Notice the absences in your community. Understand that reporting concerns isn't nosiness, it's the moral courage that separates civilization from cruelty. Lacey's voice was stolen from her, but we can give her story meaning by becoming the witnesses she so desperately needed. Because the true measure of any society isn't how it treats its stars, but how it protects its most vulnerable members from disappearing into darkness. If you've been affected by Lacey's story, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. For more true crime documentaries that combine rigorous journalism with human compassion, subscribe and enable notifications. We honor victims not through exploitation, but by ensuring their stories spark real change.